Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Ready on the stump? Yeah. Okay. Here we go. I am somebody. I am somebody. I may be poor. But I am somebody. I may be young. But I am somebody. I may be on welfare. But I am somebody. I may be small. But I am somebody. I may make a mistake. But I am somebody. My clothes are different. My face is different. My hair is different. But I am somebody. I am black, brown, white. I speak a different language. But I must be respected, protected, never rejected. I am God's child. I am somebody. Give yourself a big hand.
The Reverend Jesse Jackson passed away on February 17th, 2026, surrounded by his family. In a statement, the Jackson family said that Jackson's unwavering commitment to justice, equality, and human rights helped shape a global movement for freedom and dignity. In their own tribute, Barack Obama and Michelle Obama wrote, "From organizing boycotts and sit-ins to registering millions of voters, to advocating for freedom and democracy around the world, he was relentless in his belief that we are all children of God, deserving of dignity and respect." Jackson was born and raised in my hometown of Greenville, South Carolina, and many people remember him from his appearances in the headlines, but there are just as many who remember him for the ways he touched their lives off camera. This week, Baptist News Global has published a couple pieces about Jackson's influence both publicly and behind the scenes. I'd like to read two of these pieces to give you a sense of how his public and private life affected the least of these. The first piece is Jesse Louis Jackson Sr., An American Icon by Edmund W. Davis. It was published by B&G on February 19th, 2026. And the second piece is My Emmaus Encounter with Jesse Jackson by Basil Dannenbaum. It was published on February 18th, 2026. After sharing these two pieces, I'll be joined by current B&G Clemens Fellow Braxton Wade to talk about how Jackson and the response of white Christians to Jackson's work has shaped his own advocacy. Jesse Louis Jackson Sr., An American Icon by Edmund W. Davis. This week, the nation pauses to honor the life and legacy of Jesse Jackson, an American icon whose voice shaped movements, elections, diplomacy, and generations of hope. For more than 6 decades, Jackson stood at the intersection of faith and freedom, preaching not only from pulpits, but from podiums, picket lines, and presidential stages. His journey stretched from the segregated South to global diplomacy, marked by conviction, controversy, courage, and an unwavering belief in justice. Born October 8, 1941 in Greenville, South Carolina, Jesse Louis Burns entered a nation divided by law and custom. After being adopted by his stepfather, Charles Henry Jackson, he carried the Jackson name into history. Even in his youth, he exhibited an uncommon presence, athletic, articulate, and deeply aware of the racial barriers surrounding him. Many who observed Jackson's life believed his calling was evident early. His destiny would be rooted in ministry and movement. Jackson attended the University of Illinois before transferring to North Carolina A&T State University, where he thrived as a student leader. His path changed in 1965 when he joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and became a protege of Martin Luther King Jr. Under King's mentorship, Jackson sharpened his organizing and oratorical skills. He was present in Memphis on April 4, 1968, when King was assassinated, a tragedy that deepened his commitment to carry the movement forward. In 1971, he founded Operation Push, later expanding it into the Rainbow Push Coalition. Push blended protest with policy, urging corporations to hire black executives, contract with minority-owned businesses, and invest in underserved communities. Jackson believed civil rights without economic rights left freedom incomplete. His message echoed the words of Micah 6:8. He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. Justice, mercy, humility. These themes defined his preaching and activism. By the 1980s, Jackson stepped into the national political stage. By 1984 and 1988, he ran for President of the United States, becoming the first African-American candidate to build a viable campaign with a major political party. His Rainbow Coalition united African Americans, working-class whites, Latinos, Native Americans, labor unions, and farmers under a shared vision of opportunity and equity. His rallying cry, "Keep Hope Alive," became one of the most enduring phrases in American political culture, paving the way for future leaders and expanding the nation's democratic imagination. Beyond domestic politics, Jackson became a global humanitarian. He negotiated the release of American prisoners in Syria and Cuba during the 1980s and advocated for the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. He entered rooms others could not and spoke where diplomacy had stalled. Yet his life was not without imperfection. In the early 2000s, he publicly acknowledged an extramarital affair that resulted in the birth of a daughter. The revelation wounded his public image. Still, he addressed the matter openly and returned to public service, continuing his advocacy through Rainbow Push and mentoring younger activists. Accountability and continued service marked that chapter of his journey. Jackson's legacy is defined not merely by his speeches, but by presence. He stood with the Jena 6 in Louisiana when racial tensions reignited national attention. He crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, honoring the legacy of Bloody Sunday. Even as Parkinson's disease slowed his body, he remained spiritually steadfast, appearing as recently as 2022 to inspire new generations to continue the work. Through decades of change, Jackson registered millions of voters, challenged corporations toward accountability, pressed for educational access, and demanded economic justice. He moved comfortably between church sanctuaries and convention halls, protest lines, and diplomatic missions. He remained, at heart, a preacher shaped by the black church tradition, rhythmic, passionate, uncompromising in hope. Jesse Louis Jackson Sr. moved people toward courage. He moved systems toward justice. He moved nations toward dialogue. He was not perfect, but he was present. Not flawless, but faithful. Today, America reflects on a life that helped bend the arc of history. His message still echoes across generations, rooted in faith and fueled by perseverance. Keep hope alive. And then my Emmaus Encounter with Jesse Jackson by Basil Dannenbaum. Jesse Jackson once said, "I am not a perfect servant. I am a public servant doing my best against the odds. As I develop and serve, be patient. God is not finished with me yet." On February 17th, God called our brother Jesse home. Jackson was born October 8, 1941 in Greenville, South Carolina. He rose to prominence during the Civil Rights era, participating in demonstrations alongside Martin Luther King Jr. He fought against injustice to his last breath, and his activism spanned decades. Our father was a faithful servant leader, not only to our family, but to the oppressed, the voiceless, and the overlooked around the world, the Jackson family said in a statement. Civil rights leader Al Sharpton said in a statement, "Reverend Jackson stood wherever dignity was under attack, from apartheid abroad to injustice at home. His voice echoed in boardrooms and in jail cells." On the morning of his death, I wept as I drove to St. George Orthodox Cathedral for Divine Liturgy. Between the tears, I prayed for the repose of Jesse's soul. For me, his death was personally devastating. Like Jesse, I devoted much of my career to both ministry and public service. We likewise shared some similar neurological issues. But the connection didn't stop there. 7 years ago, my flight was delayed at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. I decided to stop into one of the concourse restaurants for a bite to eat while I passed the time. There were no seats available. Just as I was turning around to leave, a gentleman tapped me on my shoulder. "Sir," he said, "my boss sent me over to invite you to join him at his table." He pointed to a table where Jesse Jackson was seated. I couldn't believe my eyes. As I approached, Jackson stood up, shook my hand, and invited me to sit down. I remember being awestruck. I stand 5'11". He was at least 6'3", but for some reason he seemed much taller, dare I say, larger than life. Jackson said he invited me to join him because I looked tired. He elaborated, not just fatigued, like something is weighing you down. I had a lot on my mind that particular evening. It had nothing to do with the delayed flight, though. In fact, it was one of my darkest hours. He invited me to eat, drink, and share if I felt inclined. There was no pressure. Although I tried to play it cool, I broke down, wept, and poured my heart out to him. He listened. He didn't judge. When I finished, he took my hands and told me everything was going to be all right. He shared some thoughts without talking down, preaching, or making it feel too much like advice. When he concluded, I felt like a heavy weight had been lifted. I believed him when he said everything would be all right. We spent the next hour or so eating and visiting as if we were old friends. At the end of the meal, he insisted on paying. As we left, he embraced me, thanked me for joining him and sharing, again reiterating that everything would be all right. In time, everything was indeed all right. In the Emmaus account of Luke 24:31, we read, "Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight." That evening at Chicago's O'Hare Airport was an Emmaus encounter I will always cherish. I felt the presence of Christ, unconditional love and hospitality through the Christian witness of Jesse Jackson, who once said, "Never look down on anybody unless you're helping him up." He helped me up. For that, I'll be eternally grateful. Here with me to talk about Jesse Jackson is current BNG Clemens Fellow, Braxton Wade. Growing up, when did you first become aware of Jesse Jackson, and how has his work in the civil rights movement shaped your understanding of what it means to be a young black journalist discussing issues of religion, politics, and race today?
Rick, that's a really great question. I think I first got introduced to Jesse Jackson. I think I was like 5, maybe 6. Jesse Jackson was about 11 or 12 years older than my grandmother. And so she remembers very vividly certain stories, and she's met him personally, and kind of saw him grow into who he became. And when I think about, I was in middle school when my mom first used the phrase like "I am somebody" with us as kids, and it is something that has echoed in my journalism, but also in like my call to vocational ministry, and in every calling and every job. Even when I got the fellowship here with BNG, my mom reminded me in a phone call, you are somebody, right? And like made me do the whole thing. Which, what felt really silly in middle school for me has now become like a really guiding principle to how I walk into a room and how I show up in my writing. He was a legend. When we talk about our ancestors, like he is one of those folks that we talk about.
I actually opened this episode with the audio of Jackson walking a group of kids through saying, "I am somebody." And it's interesting because despite whatever differences we had, like he's having the kids talk about saying things like, "I must be respected, protected, never rejected. I am God's child. I am somebody." Why do you think so many white conservatives roll their eyes at messages like this while at the same time claiming not to be racist?
That's really fascinating. I think it's because, and I recently had an interaction with someone who was white, and they reminded me, they said, quote, "Braxton, I want to remind you that it wasn't that long ago you were considered 3/5 of a person," end quote. And I think that for a lot of white folks, this, especially white conservatives, this irritates them because they're stuck in the past. And racism is something that's learned. It is passed down from generation to generation. But what's not passed down is the education. And when I think about, I heard a quote recently that said, slavery is white history and freedom is black history. But I think we're only teaching one part of history. And, to your earlier point, this week I talked to my friend Carlisle, and she shared a story of Jesse Jackson coming to her home. And Carlisle's white. She went to Truett, and Jesse Jackson came to her home, and she tells a story about Jesse using that phrase with her and making her repeat it. It crossed lines, and I think white conservatives don't know what to do with folks who do that, right? And so I think like that's a big part of it, and I think that we we thought that we solved racism already, and so it's a thing of the past. It's something we don't need to talk about anymore. And so yeah.
Yeah. It's always such an odd thing for me because when like white evangelicals talk a lot about revival and about making America great again, like they're wanting to go back to something in the past. And they also talk about how like in the last 50 years there hasn't been this like massive repentance of people coming to Jesus. It's all like about the secularization of America. It's like, well, if you didn't have a repentance in the past, then how have you gotten over racism? It makes no sense.
You're spot on.
Some of these things are the things that I struggle with sometimes. Anyway, so I know for me, growing up in these conservative white evangelical spaces, though, like Jesse Jackson was often the butt of our jokes. Rush Limbaugh used to impersonate him and make fun of his voice. How does that constant criticism and mocking of older black civil rights leaders affect young black civil rights leaders on a more personal level?
Rick, you just touched on a point that I question every week, if not every day. When the news came across that Jesse Jackson had passed, of course I'm doom scrolling on social media, and amid all of my friends of color who were posting the impact, I came across someone making a joke. Someone that I went to uh, church with years ago, where Jesse Jackson was the butt of their joke. And not only was Jesse Jackson the butt of their joke, but they made a Dr. King joke. When I think about the impact that it has, I even think about how I show up and the tone of voice that I use. I think about what I wear. I think about, you know, uh, when we look at Obama, right? Like uh, the tan suit, right? It is everything comes under judgment, which then makes me wonder, will I ever be enough? So I might be somebody, but am I enough? Um, and I don't know how you look at the life of someone like Jesse Jackson and you don't see the impact that he made. And also, for me, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is how do you Jesse Jackson poured out his whole life for civil rights. And now in Trump era, he's seeing a lot of the things that he spent his life working for reversed. So I can't help but think that some of those last days were maybe a little rough.
Yeah. I can definitely imagine that. Like, I think that's one of the things that death reminds us of is the need for younger generations to rise up and continue the work. Like, we can't just think because we had MLK and Jesse Jackson, and then like last week I had an episode on Howard Thurman before them. Like, there's always a need for another generation to rise up. Jesus said, "The poor you will always have with you." And so there's always going to be a need for liberation. And I think that that's why it's important to have young black leaders like you continuing that work today. what do you feel like when you have a lot of that personal weight from the mocking and the caricaturing that happens in public, like, and then you're trying to come into a professional setting as a journalist, like, how does that weight affect young Black professionals and journalists and writers today?
It affects you 100%. And one of the challenges that I'm facing right now, and one of the ways I think it really shows up, is to not have mimicry, if you will, right? To not mimic the style or the voice of my white colleagues in this work. I found myself talking to a past fellow recently and just telling her that I was really trying to find my voice. And one of the things that I really appreciate about B&G is the affirmation of me using my authentic voice and not trying to sound like my white colleagues. And simultaneously, there's the inner critic in me knowing that this will go out to the world and I won't be able to get it back. Did I use the right language? Did I use the right verb? Even the way I look at the text, whether it's a scriptural text or not, like the way I read is different. And so really trying to not use mimicry in my writing, and trying to find what does it look like to have my authentic voice. And I think it's one of the pros of writing alongside some really great writers like yourself, where I can see your style, but also say, man, that's really great for Rick. And I have my own unique style and I need to stay true to that. And that can be tough, right? Especially when you see how successful your white colleagues are. So if I dress like them, if I lower my tone, if I take out a little bit of the prophetic edge, would this go further? Would this fly? But I think to the life of Jesse Jackson, what he demanded was respect. And I don't think that there is anyone on either side of the aisle who can't genuinely look at the work that he did around civil rights and not appreciate what he did for people of color.
Well, I definitely appreciate your work that you're doing and continuing the work of Jesse Jackson, and I appreciate the writing and the authenticity that you've been bringing to it, and for coming on here and sharing your thoughts with us about it all.
Thanks, dude.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow B&G daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. B&G is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.